Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the Cash Flow Memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
Next, we're ready to start. We have a really interesting segment on Nvidia, the risks Nvidia faces, but we didn't see really no change from last week. The problem is China's growth, which, as you can see, it's on Exhibit C, is flat, just like the US, just like Europe. I guess one conclusion is the Chinese economy, second largest in the world, is not mature. I mean, its GDP per capita is like $5,000 or $6,000. It's way less than Europe or us and Japan. But I guess it's mature. Other thing that chief economist in Capricorn gave a speech and said its adoption of EVs in China is the cause, but it's just Chinese economy is mature. Without that, China was providing like half the growth in oil consumption. The growth in oil consumption will be like 600,000 barrels a day, not 1,200,000, but it's going to take longer to get those supply demand settled up. So irrespective of whether or not if a ceasefire in Ukraine or whether sanctions come off Iran, the overall direction of oil price, unfortunately, it's down. Gas is a different story. Cold weather helps enormously. Look at the bottom of Exhibit B last Thursday. Gas was the minimum was approaching $5. The 26 price, which is the one that pay attention to, is up to $4.20. I sure hope this holds. If you follow this week to week, you can see in the production numbers, look at another B a day of production in 26, so that would be from 106 this year up to 109. I think most of that is coming from the Permian. Haynesville, there's certainly more activity in the Haynesville, but for the Waha price, despite cold weather everywhere, Waha, the hub where all gas is cleared, West Texas, so minus $2 today. That's just extraordinary. Part of that is pipeline maintenance on the pipes that take the gas from West Texas to the Gulf Coast, but still, it's an extraordinary event that has today. Price be negative. I hope that $4 price holds, but it is worrisome. You look at the table that after 16 weeks, increase 21 to 25, 11 out of 16 was Permian. And keep in mind, a friend of mine made this comment. Look at the price down at the bottom. I mean, the 21 price is pretty good. 370, 22 price is great at $6. That 23 and 24 were 270 and 240 of the gas check increasing. This is associated gas produced with the oil, so it's more a matter of the price of oil. So everything is bubblesome. Hopefully $4 will hold oil price the same way. 58, 59, 60 sell. I think there's a considerable downside plan. So if you've got a position you want to start, a position you want to add, I just sitting on your hands into the first quarter next to upstream oil, upstream gas, refining. Even then, I finally saw an article by someone who says, hey, our fiscal situation at 26 is going to be better at 25. That's the first article and commentary I've seen. I think these estimated prices, they still hold. There'll be a huge amount of publicity about healthcare and whether or not the subsidies get extended. But like that, obviously, the interest rates will be lower. The banks said you could do a good job. They talk about spending $1 on the banks, but there was accuracy. No one suggested it's all not going to be done. All other bodies still found some more. Healthcare, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid keeps the march up. here's an interesting statistic that Medicaid, the growth of that was partly due to Obamacare, but it's pretty darn flat. In fact, at 25, it is now 24. So I back up again at 26. I think the healthcare bracket here, the inexorable rise in healthcare costs will be moderated. So that will certainly help finally get the deficit more managed. So once again, I say this every Wednesday, but what we need to do is to get the deficit down so that our ratio will get held by the public. GNP wipes out at 100%. You see 2018 to 2019 before COVID was set down 81. And all the spending was COVID up all the way to 98. And what we need is how to level out at 102 and then start down again. That would make a huge difference in how interest rate because you don't know it's more point to slide and the bond rate, the Fed funds rate, short rates will be low. Key is what is the 10-year rate? Really important of the economy and that continue to come down. So really crucial between now and say middle of next year and that rate get down close to 4% and now get up to 5%. Like Jason, anything to add?
I guess just to comment on the Fed's decision today is for a year, maybe 2 years now, we've been saying that the 2% inflation goal is maybe out of reach with deglobalization. So the dissents on that decision were that we're still fighting inflation and maybe my concern is maybe they're fighting a battle they can't win.
Yeah. The very interesting thing on Jason's point is that gas inflation is actually pretty attractive. They're the losing ground on price utility bills. And what they need to do, by this is power prices are regulated by our state governments. We need to do things around with state governments and Waha, these AI data centers, so that they do not reach retail rates. In other words, if you need big power, finance those, set them up so that the data center pays the price, you set it up so there's some benefit to the residential there. And you can't do this on a federal basis. But I believe those others there, Republicans, Democrats, they get much more than a swamp on things. They increase the something that they really need to catch it. In the governor's race in New Jersey, this was a major issue, and I think will be a major issue on the midterms. So our elected officials and the people they appoint to supervise utility rates have really a lot of work to do. Yes. With that, our 10-minute segment today is Nvidia. It's still, I think, the highest value stock in our market. I wrote a paper a while ago about the issues faced by Nvidia, and he's had a chance to go back and look at that, see how relevant that was to actually how events turned out. But with that, over to Mike.
Okay. So yeah, back in August of 2024, we wrote a memo called Hyperscale, CapEx, and Nvidia's 5 Risks. And in it, we discussed what we saw coming for Nvidia. Not that we could necessarily predict the future, but the idea was to try to map what was happening and what decisions were Nvidia's customers really making, what would have to be true for all the hype around this AI build out to continue, and where would it potentially break. And in that intervening 18 months, we've seen Nvidia become the most valuable company in the world and even surpass $5 trillion valuation. Things have obviously gone quite well for them. What we'll do here is we'll run through the 5 risks that we identified in that previous paper and kind of see where things went with each of those. And then we'll kind of highlight the top ones that we're following now, which will be the subject of a paper that we will publish in the next week or two leading up to Christmas. So risk number one in the paper was that hyperscalers would overestimate demand. We called that CapEx digestion. So in 2024, the core fear was CapEx digestion. And the idea was early training demand looks explosive. So if everyone extrapolates that demand in a straight line up and to the right, it may cause too much building and utilization may disappoint, thus causing returns on the invested capital to disappoint and cause future build outs of data center to slow down. It's only been 18 months, but over that period, we didn't see that really at all. We did see a few hyperscalers, Microsoft in particular, pause once, but on the whole, they were short capacity this whole time. On the numbers themselves, NVIDIA's data center revenue for the 12 months ended 10/31 was $167 billion, and the run rate is over $200 billion. That's just for the data center portion. Here's another signal that is kind of most important, I think, and frankly, a lot of what people are building their investment cases for these data centers on is that the old chips, the A100s, are still fully utilized. So these chips are now 6 years old. For example, CoreWeave's CEO says that all of their A100s are sold out and their competitors are similarly sold out. So if prior generation accelerators are still totally spoken for, that's not oversupply. There's no sign of oversupply. That's market chasing compute. So we don't think this risk necessarily disappears. It just, we need to look forward and say, what is the question we need to ask ourselves? What do we need to be looking for in the future? And we think that question it's very difficult to measure, but the question is, does demand for tokens, especially inference tokens, grow slower than the GPU build out? In other words, is the capacity that we're putting online greater than what the demand is? So risk number two, depreciation mismatch. This is the economic life of a GPU versus the accounting life. This is sort of nerdy, boring stuff, but it's drawn some attention recently. So in 2024, we flagged this as something that sounded boring until it matters. Clouds were stretching server depreciation life from 3 to 4 years to 6+ years as NVIDIA's innovation cycle is accelerating. If you remember, they've switched to a 1-year cadence for their chip designs. The idea was that if GPUs were going to become economically obsolete because the new generation was so much faster, then how could you justify extending the useful life of these GPUs? And what would ultimately happen is that the companies stretching those useful lives would be artificially inflating earnings in the short run. So fast forward today, and obviously this has become a major topic of conversation, not just in financial circles, but even in more mainstream business media. Michael Berry, the fund manager who's made famous by Michael Lewis's Big Short, talked about this in some detail in some of his notes, stoking fears broadly that there are issues here. The bigger point, I think, is structural. Straight line depreciation is a very simple approach to accounting, and AI economics are not straightforward. They're very different depending on the owner. If the economic value of a GPU drops sharply early after and then flattens out, straight line can underestimate the early economic consumption and overstate the later usefulness. There's a Wall Street Journal article that was written this week by the journalist that first called foul on Enron's accounting irregularities and in the dot-com era, and a well-written article, but he comes to the conclusion that this is really sort of a non-issue. And we largely agree. I think especially for somebody like a Google or a Meta or an XAI, where the value that they get from these training runs for these models is extrapolated over a long period of time, depreciation in a straight line over 5 years is totally fine. The question and the area where it actually gets a little bit more nuanced is with the neoclouds, and specifically for the chips the hyperscalers are leasing on a spot basis. And that's because the economic value they're receiving is directly related to the rents that they get for leasing these things out. Today, most of these neoclouds are doing long-term deals, like 3-5 years, sometimes longer. So a 5-year depreciation schedule seems fine. Now, if that were to change and that the average contract shrinks to 1 year, maybe 1, 2, or 3 years, then you might see that we have a significant issue with using a 5-year depreciation schedule, because in years 3, 4, and 5, they would have to reacquire a new customer on those same chips, and there's risk that that value won't be the same. So when we look out into the future, we want to keep an eye on what the neoclouds are doing and actually receiving when it comes to contract terms. Risk number 3, the AI scaling wall. We talked about how the fear that you would get diminishing returns from bigger training runs. And we talked about the total amount of data that's available in the world. That quantity doubles every 2 years, I believe. However, there's also a risk that some of the really useful data for training an LLM is sort of just there, and the new data is maybe less accretive to a model. So this was sort of a philosophical risk in 2024. And the idea was, if you can't get much higher quality models, then how could you justify 10x the cost to train the next generation model? And what happened in reality is that scaling wall did not arrive. More important, the industry proves that it could build these data center clusters in a way that enabled the pre-training part of the model to get significantly better. And the symbol here is xAI's Colossus. If you remember last year, Elon Musk basically figured out that there was a way to have a coherent cluster of H100 GPUs larger than what the stated maximum, which was 25 or 30,000. So he figured out how to get it to initially to 100,000 and then later to 200,000. That enabled xAI to essentially leapfrog some of its competitors and now mostly catch up with the leading edge models. So what this really spurred, I believe, is the importance of networking to a data center cluster. And NVIDIA's investment in Mellanox has been very integral in this. So successive generations of the NVIDIA GPUs are highly dependent on some of these innovations in networking. And if you look at the networking line, which is now broken out in NVIDIA's financials, you'll see that the growth there is phenomenal. In fact, at a higher rate than NVIDIA as a whole or NVIDIA data center as a whole. Now there's deals announced for super large mega clusters in future generations. And that's mainly because everybody's figured out that this coherence among a large number of chips is extremely beneficial to scaling the model. As long as model capabilities keep advancing, we feel pretty strongly that you're going to continue to get more token demand. Okay, number 4, non-chip bottlenecks. So things that could change supplier demand dramatically that aren't related to the actual chips themselves. The 2 points that we picked out to discuss were 1, software efficiency, and 2, power. Software efficiency rather quickly became a point of consternation in the market because if you remember in January, DeepSeek came out with a model that was very good and used far less compute than some of the others. This DeepSeek moment caused the market to go into a bit of a panic, and under the assumption that because this was so much more efficient, people would not want to purchase as many GPUs because you can basically get more tokens for less dollars. And the opposite of that is essentially what rung true, in that because the cost per token went down due to these innovations, the quantity demanded went up. And that's something that's known as Jevons paradox. The second piece is power. And this is now probably the hottest conversation of bottleneck in the whole system. Satya Nadella said that Microsoft has chips sitting in inventory that it can't deploy because they don't have enough power. They're waiting for grid interconnection. With this large of a build out, it's not a surprise that power is going to be some sort of a problem. We know that xAI was able to solve this power issue by doing what they call behind the meter power. In other words, they're generating power on the data center site. We broadly think that it's going to shift back, and actually Satya said this himself, that it's going to shift back to being a bottleneck in chips because the energy industry tends to be very good at solving market problems like this. Another piece of this that we didn't discuss that ended up being kind of a major issue as a non-chip related bottleneck was geopolitics and export controls. During the Biden administration, the government took a different kind of stance on how they were going to regulate what would be exported. And that was actually ratcheted up after we wrote this memo. And Nvidia was not allowed to sell more GPUs into China. Just this week, and I don't think it's even finalized, the word is that Nvidia is going to be able to export some GPUs. These things change, they go back and forth. It's going to be a constant risk, and this will evolve over time. Okay, last risk here, because we're running out of time. Competition, and this is probably the most relevant. In 2024, we said competition could show up. You know, AMD and the ASIC programs at the in-house silicon divisions could be potential issues. And probably more interesting is entire paradigm shifts with the advent of quantum computing. All of those things have actually progressed. We don't think there's actually been any real chip away from NVIDIA's dominance in the data center compute market. But what has emerged really is Google as a fierce competitor. And a lot of that is attributed to their TPU v7, which interestingly is also related to the fact they were able to make their clusters coherent in a way that they were able to train a very good model, the Gemini v3 model. So AMD is always going to be there as a sort of backup player. I think all of these hyperscalers would like to have more options, but the reality is that NVIDIA is going to be the preferred platform unless the scale of a model or an application is so big that you can afford the engineering hours to re-architect the software to be native to an ASIC.
Jason, what does Mike miss in terms of assessing risks for NVIDIA?
Well, the one I've been thinking about is we run out of money to keep buying more and more chips. The growth stalls because there's just no more CapEx budget.
Yeah.
In other words, too many subsidized tokens.
And then the other thing, maintaining their margin. I mean, a 75% margin actually may not be that high for chips historically. I mean, when Intel was in a similar position, did they get their margins that high for their CPUs?
Well, I'd say Intel was never in that similar of a position because they weren't making the full server rack. Right. So the thing that's happened with NVIDIA over the last few years that is not obvious is that they've gone from being a server card manufacturer, somebody that makes really just a video game card that works with a larger computer, to now deploying entire racks and designing the entire architecture of a data center. Intel was the chip inside the server, and those servers were always produced by other people, assembled from motherboard makers and different hard drive makers. And NVIDIA is essentially vertically integrated from the bottom up. I think the battle is really system architecture, where NVIDIA is going bottom up from chip all the way up to data center. And then you have Google going the other direction, having tons of experience in building data center systems, and then diving into narrow pieces like chip design and doing some of their own custom stuff where they see the value add.
Yeah. Just one more question, and that's on valuation. If we turn to page 3, these numbers were recently updated. Mike talked about trailing 12 months. He was talking about network revenues. But I mean, that's most of what NVIDIA does here. The revenue level is $205 million, and it's kind of a run rate as of the third quarter. And free cash flow is almost $100 million. The company doesn't have any debt. It has extra cash on hand. So the company's trading for about, a little more than $4 trillion. That's about 40 or 45 times free cash flow. That's not an extraordinarily high multiple if the business can continue to grow. The growth of revenue and free cash flow is both over 50%. If they can just continue to grow at 20%, a free cash flow multiple of 40 times is not, it's high, but not impossibly high. What do you think about the chances of NVIDIA continuing to grow their sales and free cash flow at 20% a year over the next 5 years? Is that too optimistic, Jason, or what would your take be?
I think it's pretty optimistic, but if you're to believe what Jensen is saying is that the data centers that exist today are going to be replaced with AI data centers, there's still a lot of compute out there that's going to transition over from being CPU based to, GPU or TPU based. So it's trillions of dollars of data center build out ahead if that transition is to fully take place.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that it happens. The question is over what time frame and how much of that is Nvidia's.
It seems to me, most of what Mike discussed was training runs, and it seems to me the growth in tokens is got a lot to do with inference and uses, applications. Jason, in just a few minutes we have remaining, we're in healthcare, which you seem to know so thoroughly. How quickly do you think applications will grow? In other words, if tokens, my understanding is we're not talking like 20% year over year. We're talking about growth of tokens at 20% per month. Just beyond anything the tech industry has ever seen. How much of a contributor of healthcare broadly defined to that? Well, I would think healthcare would be that or more. But what's your view?
My first thought is nothing in healthcare happens fast. There's two use cases that are kind of transitioning to an AI approach pretty quickly, and it's essentially note-taking, medical notes. It'll save physicians a lot of time if they can just dictate to an app that's listening, translating it into text, and summarizing it into medical notes. The other one is radiology, and there's a couple companies that are actively, they have FDA approval. They're selling products where AI is reading MRIs, PET scans, and X-rays and that sort of thing. And there's pretty good growth there. But I think overall, the token growth you're talking about is just people using reasoning models. The models provide such a better answer when they can go through many iterations in the reasoning and essentially, Googling results and aggregating all that content to you. I think that's really the growth as we're moving away from the one shot. I don't know if any of the models do one shot. You ask it a question and it does one inference run and gives you an answer. It's doing hundreds or thousands of inferences to give you one answer now. So I think that's really the growth. And the healthcare use cases are very important, and those tokens are very valuable, but it has to be such a small percentage of the tokens generated.
So it would be, for example, a law firm would be more use of applications than say a hospital.
Yeah, I think the opportunity for healthcare is larger than it is for the legal profession, just because it's a larger percentage of GMP. But did you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think it's just the nature of the problem. If there's a lot more tokens being processed, if you're putting in a 100-page contract and asking questions of it and making edits and that kind of thing, rather than just reading one.
Right. Part of that's assuming that the paradigm that we're in today, which is primarily text-based, is the one that we stay in. I think that what's happening kind of right now, and even the live translation feature that Jason's talking about, is an example of this. As we move into things that are more audio, video driven, the token consumption is going to go up dramatically.
Right. Good. Well, we've run through our extra 5 minutes. We may, when we get to the Christmas week and the New Year's week, we may do this Monday afternoon rather than Wednesday afternoon, which is Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. But we will continue to go. We will do 52 weeks a year. We may do a little modification when we get the Christmas and New Year's week. But otherwise, we'll be here with another 10-minute segment, which I think is going to be on why Google needs Broadcom and Nvidia doesn't next week. And in the meantime, everyone be well and stay healthy. And we'll be here exactly 7 days from now. Thanks very much for listening. Take care.
The views expressed on this podcast are the host alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Neither the host nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The host and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future, and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.